So today we're talking about the question of time, about what it is, about what format it follows, and my main question for the day was about the difference between linear time and circular time.
Okay, well, we're fishing in deep water here. The question of time, what it is, and even how to think about it, is a very difficult one. I remember when I was first, when I was a young man and was thinking about it, I couldn't get my mind around it. And I think most people, when they think about it, on one hand, know perfectly well what it is. Nobody's baffled when somebody else says, "What time is it?" or "Come at 3:00." So we're not strangers to time. But if you would ask somebody, well, what exactly is time? Well, you get one answer from a physicist, another answer from a psychiatrist, another answer from a banker who's charging interest, right? All time can be thought of in different ways. Yes, you can get very exact time from, say, an atomic clock, but that's time in an objective sense. If you were to arrange Rembrandt's self-portraits in chronological order, you could learn something about time as well, but something very different from what you learn using an atomic clock. All right, so time and temporality are inescapable in human life. One of the funny things in Augustine's Confessions is that he thought he had the intellectual world reasonably well under control until somebody did the inglorious thing of asking him what time was and where it comes from and how it works, and specifically how to define it. And everyone, when thinking about that, doesn't know what they are supposed to say, because we know perfectly well what time is. It's just that we don't have any words to describe it. In a way, it's like Wittgenstein's question about what does coffee smell like? Well, we all know what coffee smells like, except that our language isn't adequate to describe it. All right. So time is a vexing problem for everyone. It seems to have something to do with motion in space for those that want to get physical or reduce it to a kind of element in the physical universe. The phenomenologists wanted to treat time as an inner experience. And when you're afraid of something or when you're anxious and hopeful about something, time passes in a very different way from the way you ordinarily experience time. So the subjectivity and objectivity of time is most interesting. And I think the best answer to the question, what is time, was given by Kant. In the 18th century. It's one of the a priori forms of human cognition. In other words, time isn't something external to you. It's one of the forms through which you experience the world. So experiencing the world temporally is part of what it means to have human experiences. You see, Kant thought his way around this and a number of other difficult problems, like what is space? Or what is unity? You should try explaining what one of something is. You'll find that although you know perfectly well, it's another one of those things that it's impossible to explain. Imagine what would happen if in first grade the teacher was teaching arithmetic and said 1 + 1 is 2, and little Johnny raised his hand and said, "Teacher, what's one of something?" And then she'll give an example of an apple or an orange. And if Johnny isn't slow, he'll pick it up. But on the other hand, this example is just reminding them of something that's already there, because they could guess anything. You mean fruit? Right? It seems, though, that we all have an idea of what one of something is. And from that, we're going to build arithmetic, moving right and left on the number line. So Kant gives us the first really good answer about time, I think. And what he says is, it's one of the preconditions for human experience. And that's a brilliant answer. Instead of making it out there and somehow inexplicable, I mean, what sense do you sense time with? Do you look at it? He says, no, of course it's not out there. There's nothing to see. It's what makes possible human experience itself. Now, historically, there have been more than one conception of time that was important in a kind of macro-cultural sense. And all archaic cultures are invested in a circular conception of time. In other words, it's a cycle that repeats itself endlessly. In that respect, it's like nature, or nature is encoded in time, right? So we have the 4 seasons, they spin round and round, and at the end of every cycle, we start a new set of the same seasonal forms. Now, we have it's 4 seasons in places like Mesopotamia. It's 5 in China, but the idea is pretty much the same. Nature is cyclical and time is cyclical. Now, what that means, of course, is that human life is cyclical, and that's actually correct. We can't avoid having a beginning and having an end. On the other hand, a cyclical view of time involves a certain degree of fatalism or pessimism, because a cyclical view of time means that the same things are happening again and again and again, and we are replicas of what has come before. You can see how this would be a very conservative conception of nature, and it would connect to a conservative conception of society, which every ancient society needs. It needs a way of holding on to its traditions. Now, one of the things that comes with monotheism is a new and important idea, and it is the idea of linear time. In other words, instead of being a circle, it's a line that has a beginning, a middle, and an end. For monotheisms, and look, in my view, there are 5 or 6 of them that need to be discussed. I know that's more than the usual roster, but I'll explain what I mean later. Monotheism involves one God in charge of everything. Now, since he's in charge of everything, and not a collection of dysfunctional people on Mount Olympus, he is completely in control, and that means that he created the universe. We are living in that creation, and since we know that everything that is created has an end, the creator is eventually going to end it, right? The only thing that's infinite and eternal is the creator itself. That's regardless of what kind of monotheism you believe in. I mean, Christianity and Judaism are both monotheisms, and of course so is Islam. But in my view, Platonism is a kind of monotheism. It's an attempt to have monotheism without revelation, but the idea is to worship the form of the good, like in Plato's Republic. And that means that the gold class are a kind of quasi-hereditary, sun-worshipping priesthood, and they're ascetics. They just get subsistence. I also think that Persian monotheism, Zoroastrianism, is extremely important. As far as I know, it's in the year 331 that a Persian emperor begins history with his accession to the throne. In other words, that's the first time history was given a literal year to begin with. So there was before the emperor, the Persian emperor, and after the Persian emperor. This point, this fixity, is going to give us a beginning, a middle, and an end to history. I think that this Persian idea, this Zoroastrian idea, which is a monotheism, whose God is represented in fire as a kind of Heraclitean dynamism, transformation, and energy. I think that when the Jews were under slavery in Babylonia, that it's sticking fast to their traditions that held them together so they weren't wiped out as a group. But when the Persians conquer the Babylonians, and then over a period of decades release the Jews and the other captives the Babylonians had, the Jews must have been dumbfounded to find out that the Persians not only showed up to free them once they stayed faithful to God's law, which looks like God's action in history. They regard Cyrus, the guy who conquered the Babylonians, as the hand of God. That's their theological linear view of history. Okay, they must have been astonished to find out they weren't the only monotheists in the world. That instead of just being the property of a small group of people who settle down after a life of nomadic herding, that a gigantic empire, the largest in the world at the time, and the first truly multi-ethnic empire, that these guys who were popularly misunderstood as fire worshippers were in fact monotheists. Okay, so it's monotheism in another culture that has to have shocked them. Now, when they leave Babylon, go back and rebuild Jerusalem, this is the age of the Second Temple, that's the age of Nehemiah and Ezra, and that's the time in which the Bible is moving from a set of oral traditions to a codified written text. Now, I think that things that are written after the Persian influence, all right, or I think that as you get further on in history, the Persian influence never really wanes, and there are archaic books of the Hebrew Bible, and there are also parts of the Old Testament where they're pretty new. For example, Daniel is from about 165 BC. That's very late. Maccabees is also late. But the idea is this. I think that the Jews very quietly borrowed some ideas from the Persians. They had to make it look like, of course, this has already been there. And in a way it is. But the Persians worked out some of the implications of monotheism, which is very interesting and very edifying, I think, for the Israelites. First off, angels start to make an appearance. I think that they play a big role in Zoroastrianism. I think that they play a greater role in Hebrew scripture after the contact with the Persians. Also very important, for a long time, the Jews don't seem to have had the idea of an afterlife. In other words, if you read something like Ecclesiastes, you die like a dog and then that's it. That's all you get. Or if you read the book of Job, look, life's awful and then you die because there's no justice in the world, and when you're dead, you're dead. But what they're going to get is a very useful dose or a very useful idea from Zoroastrianism, from the Persians, and I think it's the idea of the afterlife. Now, the reason why that's important is this. We assume to be God to be omnipotent and omniscient. Okay. This world around us is not just. Injustice exists. I don't necessarily say it flourishes, but it exists, and it's, you can reduce it, but it's ineradicable. You can't get rid of it completely. Well, if that's so, either God has created a defective world, or there needs to be an afterlife in which God evens all the scores, and people get what they have coming. People get what they deserve. In this life, they don't necessarily get what they deserve, although it's good advice to live like somebody who deserves to be happy, and then we'll see what happens. Okay, so I think the Jews got a lot from the Persians, and that emerges in the written version of Scripture. And it's like the idea of the afterlife, and without the afterlife, monotheism isn't going to work. So it's actually a really great breakthrough. Now, the Jews have the idea of Genesis, a beginning, the time when they are here in the world, and then someday the Messiah comes. That's a beginning, a middle, and an end. The Christians have the idea of Genesis, fall of man, and then the middle of history, which is Jesus on the cross, redeeming these bad people who did all this bad stuff. who fell out from God in the garden. And then there's an end of the world when God, ends the world and everything gets destroyed, and you get all that interesting stuff about bulls and a lamb and a dragon and a woman clothed. And I don't know, it's kind of hallucinatory, but there's a beginning, a middle, and an end to Christian history. Same thing is true of Islam. They have a beginning, a middle, and an end. The middle isn't Jesus on the cross. It's Muhammad getting talked to by the angel and getting the Quran. Same idea, though. So all of the monotheisms offers a way out of the cyclical fatalism of circular time. It also creates the possibility of the idea of progress, because now history has a direction. It's not just a series of meaningless events. You can plot the trajectory. It's going somewhere. And that means it has a telos, which turns out to be the will of that monotheistic God, expressed variously. And the end is the reconciliation of human beings and God.
What's the beginning, middle, and end in Platonism?
I'm sure that we can pull, I know. There's a myth of the metals, right, for how we all came to be. So that's Genesis, right? We were all on the ground with different kinds of stuff in us, gold, silver, and bronze. Then we popped out, and we had those kinds of souls.
Right.
So that's the Genesis story, okay? The middle of it is our search for the form of the good. And then the end of it, as far as I can see, is the form of the good taking over the planet. In other words, because they have the form of the good and none of their neighbors do, as our society expands and, prospers, everybody else is in the way.
It seems that the middle and the end would be confined to the individual rather than the whole world.
Could be, because you got to remember, Plato is still stuck in a circular view of time, right? He's still in some ways archaic. I think in some ways Plato is the last gasp of the River Valley solar cults, except that he gives a great Greek rationalistic spin to it. Yeah, I like that sun. There's only one of it, and it's in charge, and that's just the thing for me. So, to come back to the conception of time, Hegel and then Marx, and it's not it's not accidental that one was raised a Jew, the other was raised a Lutheran, because these traditions have an idea of linear history. What they did in the 19th century was secularize, or as I would describe it, pseudo-secularize the idea of linear time and the idea of progress. For Plato, or rather for Hegel, progress was the Geist coming to know itself, and that happened on Hegel's writing desk, because he wasn't just talking about the Geist, he was writing its autobiography, which is a very strange idea indeed. Marx, on the other hand, decided that there wasn't any Geist, and in fact, it was the development of the productive capacities of human beings that led to hierarchy and injustice, and that was about to be rectified, and a similar kind of end of history, but it would be imminent in this world. Now, the danger with any idea of an imminent eschatology, in other words, that the end of the world is going to happen here and now in a practical way, that means that you are morally allowed to do anything, because, well, there are, it doesn't much matter now that the world's going to end. So, first of all, it means that you open the door to the most hideous kind of political tyranny. Pol Pot, for example, and the Khmer Rouge. The first 2 years of the regime, they killed about a third of the population of the country. They were going to start over from day one. Why? Because they represented the end of history. They had been in a benighted state of mutual exploitation or hierarchical exploitation, and Pol Pot had a good answer. Let's kill everyone who's exploited and everybody else that we think might go with them. And that's justified because we know the direction of history, which is a way of saying they've seen a pseudo-secular version of God. This is God without a personality, right? And they're Gnostics because they're released from all moral burdens that mere human beings have. So the conception of time is something that I can't help but think about when Christmas comes, because it's the beginning of the Christian calendar. I mean, however wrong it may be, it's symbolic. It doesn't matter what the astronomy behind it is. And what it represents is hope. It's the birth of hope. Peace on earth, goodwill towards men, is not something any of the ancients would have thought of. If you look at somebody like Thucydides, he has no, not even any hope that people might turn their swords into plowshares. Instead, in the same situation, people are going to do the same stuff, and it's going to cause the same bloodshed and disaster. That's what you get with the circular view of history. All the ancient historians share it. The problem is it leads to a kind of fatalism. If you want freedom, you're going to have the possibility of doing something new, of breaking those absolute cycles. And that's why Kant, who offers us a new view of freedom as autonomy, and Hegel, strangely enough, both describe themselves as Orthodox Lutherans. And no doubt they were Orthodox Lutherans in their own opinion, but they were also no doubt Orthodox Lutherans in a way that almost no Orthodox Lutherans would understand, much less affirm. All right? But, in other words, they're deeply Christian because what they've done is taken the Christian linear idea of time and the Jewish linear idea of time in the case of Mars, but it works the same way. It's the same structure. And they claim, in some kind of very dubious way, that they can work out the trajectory that we have been traveling on. And what that means is, we're coming to some eschaton, which means an end point. In the case of Marx, it's going to be the end of exploitation, which is the end of alienation, which is essentially heaven on earth, which is an extremely dangerous and stupid idea, because when heaven doesn't show up on earth, inevitably the revolutionaries will search for a scapegoat and begin killing each other. On the other hand, Hegel says he's figured out where we're going. We're going towards the Geist and the realization of freedom, which is the understanding that what is external to them, nature, is what delimits or defines what human consciousness is. In other words, it's going to describe, or rather, Hegel's view of history is a Bildungsroman. That's German for a novel of education or development, right? A growing up novel. Well, that's what the big collective subject is doing, according to Hegel. Instead of being individuals, we got a whole species and watching it grow up. And it finally reaches its 21st birthday at Hegel's writing desk, when it finds out what it is. Because not only is knowledge power, knowledge is freedom. Remember when we read Kant that freedom and rationality are two aspects of the same thing? Imagine moving that from the level of the individual when we were thinking about the CI to the level of giant collective subjects. Now think of one giant subject composing all the giant collective subjects that have ever existed. Form them into one giant thing, and they're the cells. And what have they been moving towards? Well, perhaps the creation of a new kind of organism. And the internet may be the evolving central nervous system of that planet-sized organism. It's not at all impossible. There's plenty of, examples of increasing complexity, like when we move from unicellular to to polycellular animals. And, Hegel and the Germans want to create collective subjects out of bunches of people. And Hegel just goes the whole way. Let's all pack them into one subject and then ask where it's going and what it's been doing. Now, I don't know how much credence to place in this. It's hard to falsify, it's hard to test. On the other hand, it lends a certain coherence to the way you look at the world. Too many young people nowadays believe that they are somehow so morally gifted that they're in a position to judge everything and everyone else. It takes a while, and perhaps a little education, a little experience, for people to understand that, look, while intelligence may give you the ability to judge other people, it doesn't follow that it gives you the right, because you're not really better than them. And that's a very salutary thing to remind people of. The poisonous appeal that Platonism has towards smart people's vanity. Oh, you're really clever. I bet you should run society. There's nobody that wants to say, no, I don't think so. Be very careful of philosophical arguments that tell you how clever and smart you are. Socrates rarely did that, because rarely does real education do that. Merry Christmas to everyone.